Namaskar. Well, friends, let me heartily welcome you all to Bhim Bhashya, my audio video podcast series on Dr. Baba Sahib Ambedkar. This series comprises 54 short speeches. Duration of each is between 15 and 20 minutes. These speeches are aimed at unraveling as many as 25 different dimensions of this multifaceted genius. Friends, this podcast series is focused on Dr. Baba Sahib Ambedkar, his thoughts, his actions, his philosophy, and above all, the grand vision that he had seen for our country as a whole. This is what this podcast series is all about. So let's proceed. In this episode 12 and the next one, that is episode 13, I would like to present Dr. Ambedkar's role as a presenter of memoranda to the British government. But before we do that, let us first understand the political backdrop here. As I mentioned in one of the earlier episodes, purely for administrative reasons, Bhimrao Ambedkar had to discontinue his advanced studies when he was doing his Doctor of Science in Economics at London School of Economics and Barrister at Law in Gray's Inn in London. So he had to discontinue his advanced studies and return to India in 1917. Disappointed, humiliated, and frustrated, Dr. Ambedkar reached Mumbai on August 21st, 1917. And as a strange coincidence, just a day earlier, on August 20th, 1917, the British government had taken a historic decision. The British government had adopted a policy of introducing a limited self-government in India. This was beginning of a new era of progressive realization of responsible government of a limited character as an integral part of British India. As a part of new policy, there was going to be increasing association of Indians in every branch of administration and a gradual development of self-governing institutions. In other words, new policy was going to bring about far-reaching changes in the administrative, legislative, and financial framework of the British governance in India. Operationally, the new policy was given a concrete shape by the so-called Montagu-Chelmsford reforms. The Montagu-Chelmsford report, titled Constitutional Reforms in India, was published on 8th July 1918. As a follow-up action, under the Government of India Act of 1919, among others, a franchise committee was set up. And since the committee was headed by Lord Southborough, it was called Southborough Committee on Franchise. For Dr. Ambedkar, this was a great opportunity to make his first foray into public life in India. There began a journey that was going to continue for the rest of his life. Dr. Ambedkar gave testimony before the Southborough's Committee on January 27, 1919, and subsequently he also submitted a supplementary written note to the Southborough Committee. Nobody could have imagined at that time that the issue of franchise was going to bring Dr. Ambedkar into a direct conflict with none other than Mahatma Gandhi 13 years later. And that Dr. Ambedkar was going to be the only politician in our country whom Mahatma Gandhi contested by resorting to a fast unto death. In his testimony before the South Boroughs Committee, Dr. Ambedkar focused mainly on two issues. First was the definition, that is, coverage of the franchise. And the second one was the choice between electoral systems, between the separate electorates for untouchables and joint electorates with reservation for untouchables. Those were the two big options that we talked about. Regarding the issue of coverage of the franchise, Dr. Ambedkar argued that the proposed franchise system did not allow the untouchables to vote in large numbers. In fact, the system was preventing the untouchables from becoming a notable political force. Dr. Ambedkar argued, and I quote, "At present, when all the avenues of acquiring wealth are closed, it is unwise to require from the untouchables a high property qualification." Unquote. He emphasized, and I quote him again, "To deny them opportunities of acquiring wealth and then ask from them a property qualification for voting is to add insult to injury." Unquote. Dr. Ambedkar strongly advocated that the franchise should be pitched so low that it would enable the untouchables, as many as possible, to educate into political life. This is because, according to Dr. Ambedkar, and I quote him again, they are too degraded to be conscious of themselves. It is important to note that Dr. Ambedkar wanted to enable untouchables, as many as possible, to have the voting rights, since the untouchables were at the rock bottom. By 1917, even in the advanced countries like the United States, women did not have the voting rights. They got it in America in August 1920. And here was a young man, barely 26 years old, in a country under a foreign rule, trying to steer our country towards the universal adult franchise. That is amazing. Interestingly, around the same time, in January 1919, Dr. Ambedkar wrote a letter to Times of India under a pseudonym. Why? Because at that time he was a professor in Sydenham College, Mumbai. In that letter, Dr. Ambedkar argued that home rule was as much a birthright of an untouchable as it was that of a Brahmin. Accordingly, Dr. Ambedkar recommended that the first duty of the advanced classes was to educate, enlighten, and elevate the depressed classes. On the second issue of the choice of electorates, after some initial confusion, Dr. Ambedkar came out unambiguously in favor of separate communal electorates. According to Dr. Ambedkar, and I quote him, "The untouchables are isolated by the Hindus from any kind of social participation. Untouchables have been dehumanized by socio-religious disabilities almost to the status of slaves. They are denied the universally accepted rights of citizenship, and therefore their interests are distinctively their own interests, and none else can truly voice them." Unquote. Dr. Ambedkar severely criticized the Congress scheme that offered communal representation to the Muslims and left untouchables to seek representation in general elections. He pointed out, and I quote, "It never be forgotten that the Congress is largely composed of men who are by design political radicals and social Tories." Unquote. Dr. Ambedkar emphatically argued that communal representation with reserved seats for untouchables will not perpetuate the social divisions. He argued, in fact, quote, act as a potent solvent for dissolving them, for contacts, cooperation, and re-socialization of fossilized attitudes, unquote. Dr. Ambedkar sharply observed that if the so-called upper caste Hindus are insisting on application of the principle of self-determination in India as a whole, it would be patently wrong if the same principle was not applied to the untouchables as well. Unquote. Dr. Ambedkar forcefully argued that communal representation cannot be withheld from the untouchables because communal representation and self-determination are nothing but two different phrases which express the same notion. Unquote. This was Dr. Ambedkar's first foray into public life at the young age of 26. But it clearly demonstrated his extraordinary potential, which was going to dominate for the next 3 decades all the constitutional reforms taking place in our country. Well, friends, let's conclude this session here today. In the next episode, I'm going to talk about another historic statement by Dr. Ambedkar, one which was submitted to the Simon Commission 11 years later. The year was 1928. So long, my friends, until we meet again real soon. But before I leave, let me remind you, if you like this podcast series, like it, share it, and subscribe to it. Thank you. Dhanyavad. Namaskar.